I don't have the best memory of my childhood. Not that my childhood was bad, it wasn't, but I just don't remember that much of it compared to a lot of people. My grandfather always stood out to me, which was strange, because he was never around very much. The few times that he came around for Christmas or some other family occasion, he seemed a kind but serious man. I remember him talking to me and showing me coin tricks, and I liked the sound of his deep, rumbling voice as he told me stories about far-off lands and fantastic creatures. I remembered liking him and feeling sorry for him, because underneath it all he seemed very sad and tired. I knew that my grandmother had died not long before I was born, so I always imagined that was a lot of why he was sad. I say this all to explain that I had a limited but positive idea of my grandfather before a few days ago. Last month, my parents were killed in a car accident coming back from a movie. I live 2 states away, but as their only child and closest relative, I got the call. The next few hours were a haze of travel and crying and shock. But I know that when I got to the hospital, my grandfather was there. Even as an adult, I was amazed at how large a man he was. And when he swept me up in a quiet hug, I cried against him for several minutes, welcoming the comfort. We did the funeral arrangements together and agreed that we would come back in a few weeks to go through all their things and get the house ready to sell. He had already made clear that regardless of whether they had a will or not, he wanted everything to go to me. But he would be happy to help and get to know his grandson a little better. The funerals went well, as far as those kinds of things go, and I went back to my life. Last week I got a call from my grandfather and we agreed to meet up this past weekend to start going through all of their belongings. I got to the house on a Sunday morning, and the last couple of days have been a bit sad at times, but they've been a lot of fun as well. My grandfather is much like I remember him, a serious but kind man that enjoys talking and telling stories. And he has actual conversations with you rather than just taking turns monologuing, which is a rare commodity in my experience with older people or people in general nowadays. He wanted to know about my work, and if I had a girlfriend, if I liked the area I lived in. He told me some about his days in the army as a medic, and then his time as a doctor. I knew he had been a pretty famous surgeon at one point, but that mostly stopped after his wife died. He still had a small practice and would sometimes publish academic articles, but he had saved much of the money from his early career as a surgeon, so he was comfortable enough financially that he could do what he wanted for the most part. Much of our time was spent busy and in separate parts of the house or garage, so we would largely talk at meals and in the evening hours before bed. By the second night, we were more comfortable with each other, and that's when my grandfather started telling me about his wife. Even now, some 30 years after her death, it was clear how much he loved her and missed her. He started off by telling a story that involved her only peripherally, but soon he was just telling things about her. Funny stories, tales that illustrated how smart or good she was, little sayings she used to have. It was sentimental, but it was so genuine and heartfelt that I wasn't uncomfortable. Seeing how much he loved her made me love both of them more. I had no sooner finished that thought when his expression turned darker, like a ship entering sudden storms. He started talking about how she was taken from him, how that man, that thing, had killed her. I just listened, but internally I was wondering where this was all coming from. As far as I knew, my grandmother had been killed by a drunk driver. While that was terrible, he was making it sound like it was something else, like she had been intentionally murdered in some way. It was all pretty vague, but I could still see when he realized he was saying more than he intended. He looked embarrassed and apologized for rambling on, making some passing remark about how he had become the old man at the mall that talks for hours about nothing. I laughed and was going to reassure him that I was enjoying it, but he was already on his feet looking at his watch. He had to be going, he said. Had to run into town to take care of a couple things before it got too late, but he'd see me in the morning. I found this all very strange for a couple reasons. First, we'd just gone to town earlier that day and bought supplies and groceries to last at least a couple more days. Second, it was nearing 10 o'clock, and aside from a gas station or a bar, I doubted much would be open in the closest town, which was relatively small and a good 30 minutes away. Still, he was a grown man and my elder, and it was none of my business where he went or what he did. Maybe he just wanted to go off and be by himself after talking about his wife so much. In any case, I said goodnight, and he headed out. A minute later, I heard his giant SUV rumble to life outside and trundle its way out into the night. I went to bed, but though I was tired, I had trouble falling asleep. Part of it was sleeping in a strange place. This house hadn't been our house when I was growing up, so aside from visits, I had never slept here for long. Part of it was worrying about my grandfather. My bed was next to a window on the upper floor, so periodically I would peek out to see if I saw any sign of his return. The moon wasn't full, but it was still bright enough to shine off the lawn and the trees that grew thick as they became woods and then forest. It was beautiful. And I knew my parents had loved it here. Still, it was way too remote for my tastes, and if they hadn't lived so far out of town, they probably wouldn't have gotten killed coming back from a movie. The thought made me angry, so I pushed it aside. Picking up my tablet, I started reading, and before I knew it, I was asleep. I'm not sure if it was the rumbling engine, the squeak of my grandfather's driver's side door, or some internal sense that something had changed, but I woke up sometime later and looked out the window again. I saw my grandfather standing at the rear of his SUV, looking around for several seconds before opening the back hatch. At first, I couldn't see anything due to the angle, but when he reached in and started pulling out the body, I saw more than I wanted. It was a woman, and as I watched, he pulled her out enough to pick her up in his arms and began carrying her into the trees. I know it was nighttime and there was a distance of probably 50 yards, but I could see it all very clearly. And with her hanging arms and lolling head, it was also clear the woman was either deeply unconscious or dead. I felt panic well up in my chest. I didn't know what to do. Should I call 911? What if I was mistaken or he was trying to help her? Maybe she was drunk? But if he was trying to help her, wouldn't he have either carried her to a hospital or at least brought her inside here rather than carrying her into the woods? It was all so strange, and the longer he was gone out of sight, the less real it seemed. So I did nothing. I sat by the window, looking out for a number of minutes, and then just when I was about to give up, he came back into view empty-handed and picking his way between the trees as he approached the car. He shut the back hatch on the SUV with a shake of his head and then looked up, right at where I sat in the window. When I first saw the body, I'd been careful to lay low and slightly back from the window, but time and shock had led me to paying less attention to how visible I was as I waited for him to return. There was no doubt he saw me now. As if to confirm it, he lifted his hand and gave a small wave. Feeling a strange combination of embarrassment and horror, I waved back. As I'm writing this, it's the next morning, and I've spent the last several hours deciding what to do or say to him while listening out for the slightest creak of the floor or turn of the knob. He may not know I saw the woman, and I guess there could be some benign explanation, though that seems unlikely at this point. Either way, I hear and smell him cooking breakfast, and he's going to be knocking on my door soon. I love my grandfather, but I don't trust him. Not anymore. I think I'm going to try to talk to him, but at the first sign of trouble, I am out the door. If I have more to report, and I'm able to do so, I'll write again soon. I left off while I was still upstairs trying to decide what to do. I'd considered just waiting for my grandfather to come up and get me for breakfast, but the idea of him in the doorway of the only exit from the room made me very nervous. I wound up just getting dressed, putting my keys and wallet in one pocket and a small folding knife in the other, and heading downstairs. He was still at the stove when I entered the kitchen, and despite my fear, I could feel my stomach grumble at the smell of eggs, bacon, and coffee that permeated the air. Not that I could trust eating any of it, but my stomach wasn't concerned with trivial matters like rat poison or antifreeze. He turned and gave me a nod as I made my way to the table. "Morning. I was about to come get you in a few minutes. I hope you're hungry." "Nah, not too much," I lied. "My stomach's been weird this morning, so I think I'm gonna have to wait. Smells great, though." I sat down in a chair where I could face him and reach the door outside or the living room quickly if things went south. He nodded his head and kept on poking at the eggs. "Well, that's a shame. It'll be here for you if you feel up to it a bit later." He set the pan of eggs on an unlit burner and turned to face me, his expression slightly concerned. "Don't think you're getting sick, do you?" I shook my head, weighing different lies and excuses, but finally I decided this was as good of an opportunity as I was going to get to broach the topic of what I'd seen the night before. I've just been a bit worried since last night. I saw you when you came back last night. My grandfather was nodding already, but I pushed on. I saw all of it, not just when you came back from the woods. I saw the woman you had. His expression didn't change at first, but after turning off the stove and taking a seat across the table from me, I saw a mixture of worry and sadness on his face. "I thought you most likely had, and I know how something like that must look. I didn't want to frighten you by approaching you about it, and if I'm honest, I was hoping you had missed the first part. Not the way I wanted you to find out." He rubbed his mouth and gave a nervous smile. "Still, I was half afraid you'd be gone when I got up this morning, or that there'd be police out here. I know you can't trust me right now, but giving me the chance to explain means a lot to me." I nodded. His words were said in an even and reasonable tone, but I couldn't help feel a dull dread growing in my stomach. A part of me had hoped he would deny everything and convince me it was a dream or a mistake. Instead, he was confirming that it happened. And I'd be lying if I said he wasn't intimidating, even in his kindest moments. He was very intelligent and half a foot taller than me, and the last couple of days had been proof enough that age had slowed him very little. Last night he carried that woman without any signs of real effort, carried her lifeless body out into the dark to come back to me. I know this is frightening. I can tell you that you have no reason to be afraid of me, but how much is that worth right now? Very little, I suspect. So let me explain as best I can. All I ask is that you listen to the entire thing, and at the end of it all, if you want to call the police or leave or whatever you think is best, I will be fully cooperative. but I need you to hear the entire thing, because some of it is going to sound very strange at first. Okay? I leaned back in my chair, my head pounding. This was the point where I had to make a decision to give him a chance or not. Whether to risk myself even more or not. On the one hand, I could run and call the cops. On the other, I could hear him out, and in theory, still do that if I didn't like or believe what he told me. Still. Where did we put the tape? When he raised an eyebrow, I shrugged. I'll hear you out, but I want you taped to that chair before we start. I can't risk this being a trick or you deciding it's not going your way and you want to attack me. I could see the hurt in his eyes, but I pushed past it. I want to believe you, to trust you, but you know it's the smart thing to do on my end. He nodded. It is. I'm proud of you for thinking it. I just hate that it comes to that. But that's my fault, not yours. It's in the living room, I think on the table by the sofa. Standing up slowly, I backed into the living room and grabbed the tape, fearful for the 5 seconds he was out of sight. But he was waiting in the same spot when I came back in, and he sat still while I put layers of tape around his chest and arms, securing him firmly to the back of the wooden chair he sat in. Pausing for a moment to consider, I then wrapped the remaining tape around his ankles and the front chair legs just to be safe. The job done, I asked him if he was comfortable enough. When he said he was, I sat back down across from him, my hands sweaty and slightly shaking as I tried to give him a comforting smile. Sorry again, but I'm ready to hear everything you want to tell me. My grandfather looked off in the distance for a moment before focusing his dark blue eyes on me. Your mama told you that my wife, your grandmother, Rebecca, died in a car wreck. A drunk driver, right? I nodded. Yeah, she said she was killed going to visit you at the hospital. You'd been working on a patient for hours and she was bringing you dinner. Dark anger flickered across his face, disappearing as he shook his head. Well, the last part was right. I had been working on a girl who'd been shot in a hunting accident since early afternoon. The girl wound up living, but my sweet girl, your grandmother, she didn't get killed by a drunk driver. She was taken as she was getting out of her car at the hospital, brutalized and torn apart, with what was left of her being found in a field 10 miles away. His voice grew rough and cracked with emotion as he spoke. I didn't even know anything was wrong at first, but someone found the covered dish she was bringing me in the parking lot, dropped and broken. They figured out it was her car and then they came to me. I had just finished the surgery an hour earlier, but still had another 5 hours on my shift, so I went to take a nap, thinking she would wake me up when she got there. Instead, it was one of the admins asking if I had seen my wife that evening. He spread his hands out on the table, long-fingered and steady even at his age. Staring at them, he continued. Your grandmother was a smart woman, a good woman. Sure, things were safer back then than they are now, but wasn't like no one ever got hurt or killed. Even in a smaller town like we lived in, it happened. But she had no real enemies. She was always careful when she traveled anywhere. My point is that no one would have easily gotten a jump on her. The police said at first that it could just be a misunderstanding, or she could have just decided to leave, as stupid as that sounded. I spent all night looking for her, terrified and half out of my mind. By the next morning, the police were there with me. It was just before noon when they found her body in that field. I made the mistake of going to the scene. I told myself that I was used to blood, to everything a body could show, and that I owed it to her to see how she died. It was beyond anything I imagined. One arm and the opposite leg had been completely torn off, and her torso had been shredded to such a degree that it didn't look like a person at all. And that was actually better because it made it seem unreal. But then I saw her long, light brown hair. I had always loved her hair so much, and even attached to the shattered ruin of her face, I knew it anywhere. It was remarkably clean compared to the rest, as though someone or something had taken great care not to mess up or soil that pretty hair. That thought is what broke me, I think. I don't remember much for the few days that followed, but I know I was at her funeral, but I couldn't tell you anything about it. When I finally resurfaced from whatever stupor I was in, I was sitting at home with my brother and his wife. They were trying to keep me company. We were watching TV, I think. I wanted to scream at them, to yell, to make them understand this was all pointless now, that my life was over, that everything was over, so why were they trying to prolong things? Instead, I just told them that I appreciated their help and attention, but that I knew they needed to be getting back home and that I needed time to myself. They wasted little time in packing up and heading out. I spent the next day or so weighing various methods of suicide. I really had no interest in living in a world without her. I believe in God, and I think suicide is a shame, and likely a sin when done for such selfish reasons. But I was to the point where I didn't care. I didn't care if I went to hell for it. I felt like I deserved it for letting this happen to her. But this led me down the path of dwelling on what had happened to her and what had caused it, who had caused it. I set aside my ideas of pills and ropes and self-inflicted gunshot wounds, got a shower and a shave, and I went down to the local police station. Over the next few weeks, I continued to harass and harangue them, pushing them to do more, while understanding there was likely little more they could do. They had looked for witnesses, and there were none. They had looked for evidence of how the attack was committed, and had only come up with injuries caused by indeterminate, blunt, and serrated objects. There were no cameras at the hospital until 3 years later, and this was before the age of cell phones to track. After bullying them with a threatened lawsuit, I obtained copies of all their photos and reports. I pored through them, but found little more of note. The parking lot was paved, so there were no tire tracks to follow, and no tire or shoe tracks had been found near the field where she was killed. Something about the parking lot stuck out to me, but I wasn't sure what it was at first. After 2 days of looking at everything, it hit me. The hospital had a separate parking lot for doctors and surgical staff that was blocked by a mechanical arm and a keypad. Rebecca had the passcode, so she had parked there when she was taken. That parking lot was on the far rear of the hospital, not visible from the road and without any hospital roads or paths that would make it a thoroughfare for casual passersby. What were the odds that someone had happened upon her just as they went by, or decided to wait in a relatively small and quiet parking lot for hours until they had a chance to snatch someone? I decided it seemed unlikely. In retrospect, I know it was certainly possible I could have been wrong, but at the time, I needed answers. And I decided focusing on someone who worked in the hospital and or had access to the parking lot like my wife was the best course of action. Among all the complaints I might have had about the investigation of Rebecca's murder, I would never have made it further without them. One of the detectives had pulled a tissue sample from under her fingernails and had sent it to be tested if they ever got something to compare it to. Understand, this was 1986 and DNA testing was brand new. It wasn't even an option at the state crime labs at the time, and the likelihood of that sample ever being of use was small to none. But I still had to actually file a lawsuit to get the sample back, so I could send it to Daniel Church, a friend of mine from med school that had gone on to work at one of the foremost labs for DNA in the country. He couldn't do tests for me officially, but he knew what I was going through and agreed to help as much as he could in unofficial capacity. The main thing that he needed was viable samples from a suspect for comparison. Fortunately, that was the easy part. Hospital policy required all operating room doctors and staff to have semi-annual blood work as both a check for any substance abuse issues and as a screening mechanism for any potential infectious disease. After testing, the remainder of those samples were stored until the next round of tests 6 months later. The tests weren't all done at once, of course, but at any given time there were 23 samples cooling in a fridge in the serology lab. So I pulled some from each of them and sent them to Church. He called me 2 days later, his tone grave. He asked where I'd gotten so many samples so quickly. What was I getting him into? I told him I wasn't getting him into anything. At most, he was running some DNA tests with no indication of who was being tested or why. And if anyone ever asked me, I hadn't seen or heard of him since we graduated 15 years earlier. I could tell he was still troubled, but after a long silence, he agreed to run the tests. The next 5 weeks were excruciating. DNA testing was much slower back then, and I understood he was having to go slower than normal to do it in a clandestine manner. Still, every day I was constantly waiting for the phone to ring, and when it finally did, I could hardly hear Church over the frantic thudding of my own heart. I asked him to repeat what he had said.
The tissue you sent first is a match to sample 17. It's from that person or their identical twin.
I thanked him and hung up the phone. I had sent him numbers instead of names on the samples, but I knew whose was whose by heart at this point. Sample 17 belonged to an orthopedic surgeon at the hospital, Marcus Salk. He was a chubby, middle-aged man that was always telling jokes and had a reputation as a good doctor. I didn't know him very well, but I had always gotten along with him fine. Why would he do this? My first urge was to find him and torture him until he told me why. I could feel my rage building as the information soaked in, my mind racing to dissect any interaction we had ever had, any scrap of knowledge I had about him. I thought that he had come to the hospital about 5 years earlier, was unmarried, had a cat, maybe. I realized how little I knew and how I needed to learn more before I committed an act and either hurt the wrong person or gave them an unintentional means of escape. That's when I began studying Marcus Salk.